The narrator grew up in a massive, crowded city. The noise was constant. Sirens blared at all hours of the night. Traffic never seemed to stop, and there was always a thick layer of smog hanging over the skyline. It was the kind of environment where you never truly felt alone, but you also never felt at peace. Every morning was a rush of angry commuters, packed subway cars, and the endless honking of horns. The narrator knew from a very young age that this was not the life they wanted. They dreamed of wide-open spaces, quiet mornings, and clean mountain air. As soon as they graduated, saved up enough money from working odd jobs, and could finally afford to make a move, they packed up their belongings and left. They did not have a solid plan, but they knew they wanted to go north. They drove away from the concrete jungle and headed toward the mountains, watching the tall buildings disappear in their rearview mirror as the trees began to take over the landscape. They ended up in a tiny rural community nestled deep in the forest. It was a complete contrast to the city. The air was clean, the mountains were massive, and the silence was almost deafening at night. In the summer, the trees were a brilliant, lush green, and in the autumn, the leaves turned incredible shades of red, orange, and yellow. It was beautiful, yet it remained largely undiscovered by tourists. There were no big hotels, no amusement parks, and no crowded souvenir shops. The town had just a few essential spots. There was a local supermarket, a single gas station where the owner also did car repairs, 2 small restaurants, a couple of quiet bars, and a tiny police station with only a few officers on duty. The nearest major department store was over an hour's drive away. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and news traveled fast. The narrator bought a small, modest house on the edge of the woods and began their new life of quiet isolation. To support themselves, the narrator took a part-time job at the local supermarket. Having previously managed a large grocery store chain back in the city, they had plenty of experience. They knew how to handle inventory, manage staff, organize delivery schedules, and deal with suppliers. The owner of the small-town store was thrilled to have them, and even offered them a full-time management position right away, with a very generous salary for the area. But the narrator turned it down. They did not want the stress of running a store anymore. They had left the city to escape that kind of pressure and responsibility. They only wanted a simple, low-stress job to earn some extra spending money and get out of the house. Most of their actual income came from a part-time online job that they could do on their own schedule. This arrangement gave them the ultimate freedom. They wanted as much free time as possible to explore the endless wilderness surrounding the town. There were so many miles of dense forest and hidden trails that it would take several lifetimes to explore them all, but the narrator was more than ready to try. Every single day off, regardless of the weather, they would pack a bag, grab their gear, and head out into the woods. Rain, snow, or sunshine, they were out there. They bought topographical maps, studied the local terrain, and invested in high-quality hiking gear. And in the evenings, they would head into town to grab a bite to eat at the local diner and try to integrate themselves into the community. For the most part, the locals were incredibly warm and welcoming. They were pleasant, helpful, and always ready to share a story about the history of the valley. Except for one man. His name was Hector. Now, Hector was not necessarily mean or aggressive to the people he met. He was just incredibly strange. He seemed to operate on an entirely different wavelength from the rest of the world. The very first time the narrator met Hector, it was a chilly morning just after 5. The narrator had just pulled into the supermarket parking lot for their early morning shift. The sun was not even up yet, and the parking lot was completely empty and dark. The only light came from a single flickering street lamp near the entrance. As the narrator turned off the engine and opened the car door, a figure suddenly rushed out of the shadows. Before the narrator could even step out of the vehicle, this man ran right up to the open car window. Coming from a rough neighborhood in the city, the narrator's immediate instinct was to defend themselves. In the city, if someone rushes your car in the dark, you prepare for a fight. The narrator threw their hands up in a defensive block and started shouting at the intruder to back away. But instead of attacking, the man just leaned in, screamed directly into the narrator's face, and then did something entirely unexpected. He turned around and skipped away. He did not run or walk. He literally skipped like a joyful child, disappearing down the dark street. The narrator stood there by their car, completely bewildered. their heart pounding in their chest. A few moments later, one of their coworkers, an older man named Bill, arrived for the morning shift. Seeing the narrator looking shaken and pale, Bill asked what had happened. When the narrator explained the bizarre encounter, Bill laughed and shook his head. He told the narrator that the man's name was Hector and that he was completely harmless. According to Bill, Hector had been wandering around the town for years. Nobody knew exactly where he came from, where he slept, or who his family was. Most people assumed he was homeless and probably slept under one of the old wooden bridges on the edge of town. The locals just accepted him as a quirky part of the community. They left him alone, and in return, he never actually hurt anyone. So the narrator decided to let it go. Over the next few weeks, they started seeing Hector everywhere. It did not matter what time of day it was. Whether the narrator was driving to work at dawn or leaving a local bar after 11 at night, Hector was always there, wandering the streets. He was a short man, probably no taller than 5 feet 3 inches, but he was incredibly broad and built like an ox. He always wore the exact same outfit, a dirty, stained white tank top and bright royal blue pants that looked like a cross between sweatpants and heavy denim. He had a long, unkempt gray beard that hung down to his chest, and while the top of his head was completely bald, he kept the rest of his hair in a long, messy ponytail. But the most distinctive thing about Hector was his movement. He never walked normally. Whenever he was on the move, he skipped. He would skip down the sidewalks, past the shops, and along the dirt roads, seemingly without a care in the world. Sometimes the narrator even felt a strange sense of envy looking at him. Hector seemed completely detached from the stresses of modern life, living in his own peaceful, blissful world. The locals would sometimes leave food or warm clothes on their porches for him, and by the next morning, the items would be gone, replaced occasionally by a wild flower or a unique stone. But one morning, things began to feel a little more unsettling. The narrator was driving to work, approaching a quiet intersection in town. It was a foggy morning and visibility was low. They spotted Hector standing on the corner, his back turned to the incoming traffic. He was waving his hand enthusiastically, as if greeting an old friend across the street. But as the narrator drove closer and scanned the area, they realized there was absolutely no one there. The street was completely empty. As the narrator passed by, they could see Hector's face. He was talking animatedly, his mouth moving rapidly, gesturing wildly to the empty air. It was a bit strange, but the narrator brushed it off. It was not uncommon for people in Hector's situation to talk to themselves, and as long as he was not hurting anyone, it was none of their business. But then came the weekend, and the narrator decided to hike a brand new section of the deep forest that they had never explored before. They chose an area several miles north of the town, a dense wilderness known for its rugged terrain and steep ridges. They spent hours trekking deep into the forest, miles away from the nearest road or house. It was peaceful, quiet, and completely isolated. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the high canopy and the occasional call of a bird. But as they were walking through a particularly dense thicket of pine trees, they suddenly stopped. Through the quiet forest air, they heard a voice. It was faint at first, a distant echo bouncing off the trees. Hearing any human voice when you are miles deep in the wild is instantly alarming. This was not a public park with marked trails. This was rugged, untouched wilderness. The narrator felt a cold sensation run down their spine. Their logical mind told them to turn around and walk back the way they came. But curiosity got the better of them. They wanted to know who else was out here and why they were making so much noise in such a remote area. Slowly, carefully, the narrator began to step toward the sound. As they crept closer, the voice became clearer. It did not sound like a normal conversation. It sounded like someone was in severe distress, crying out in pain or fear. The narrator reached into their pocket and quietly unfolded their pocket knife, keeping it hidden in their hand just in case. They moved as silently as possible, stepping over dry leaves and fallen branches, trying not to make a sound. The voices were coming from just behind a thick group of trees directly ahead. The narrator carefully peeked around a large oak trunk, and what they saw made their hearts stop. There were not multiple people. There was only one person. It was Hector. He was sitting on a fallen log, but he was acting in a way the narrator had never seen before. He was talking to himself, but he was using entirely different voices. He would speak in a harsh, angry, belittling tone, calling himself a coward and screaming insults. Then, in the blink of an eye, his posture would collapse, and he would begin to weep uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness in a completely different, high-pitched, pathetic voice. Each voice sounded so distinct, so entirely different from the other, that it felt like watching two completely different people trapped in one body. The narrator decided right then and there that they were not going to make their presence known. They stayed frozen behind the tree, waiting for Hector to finish his episode, so they could quietly slip away and head back to their car. But then, the angry voice returned. Hector stopped weeping, sat up straight, and without even turning his head to look, he screamed in a roaring, terrifying voice that he is hiding behind the tree, and this time you cannot let him get away. Before the narrator could even process what Hector had just said, Hector stood up. He turned his head slowly and locked his eyes directly onto the narrator's hiding spot. For the first time, there was no blissful ignorance or childish joy in Hector's face. His eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated rage. The narrator took a panicked step backward. In an instant, Hector charged. He was not skipping anymore. He was sprinting on all fours and then upright, moving with an unbelievable, terrifying speed. He was built like an ox, and he was coming fast. The narrator turned and ran as fast as their legs could carry them, sprinting back in the direction of the trailhead. For what felt like hours, the narrator could hear Hector right on their heels. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling that the narrator would never make it out of the forest alive. He would let out a wild, manic laugh, followed by another guttural scream. Every few moments, the sounds of snapping twigs and heavy breathing felt so close that the narrator expected to feel Hector's hands grab them from behind. But the narrator kept running, fueled by pure adrenaline, ignoring the branches scratching their face and the rocks tripping their feet. Eventually, the sounds began to fade. The heavy footsteps grew more distant, and the screaming finally stopped. The narrator kept running until they burst through the tree line and reached the safety of their car. They scrambled inside, locked the doors, and scanned the woods. Hector was nowhere to be seen, shaking uncontrollably. The narrator drove straight to the town's small police station. They burst through the doors and recounted the entire terrifying encounter to the sheriff. The sheriff listened quietly, but she looked skeptical. She had known Hector for years, and simply could not picture the harmless, skipping local acting with such violent rage. But as the narrator described the exact location of the encounter, deep in the woods, the sheriff's face suddenly drained of color. She turned white as a ghost. She looked at the narrator and explained that the location they were describing was highly significant. Years ago, deep in that exact section of the wilderness, hunters had discovered the skeletal remains of a local man who had gone missing. The man, a local woodworker named David, had vanished without a trace, leaving his family devastated. The death had been ruled a homicide, but the killer was never found. It was a dark, unresolved blemish on the town's peaceful history. The sheriff sat back, a look of realization dawning on her face. She began to think back to when Hector first appeared in the town. Her memory was a bit fuzzy, but she realized that Hector had started showing up, skipping through the streets, around the exact same time those remains were discovered. The sheriff decided they needed to investigate immediately. She asked the narrator to guide her and a deputy back to the spot. They hiked out to the area as quickly as possible, but by the time they arrived, Hector was gone. In fact, Hector was never seen again. He completely vanished from the town after that day. It was as if he had disappeared into the very woods that held his secrets. The sheriff eventually retired, carrying the weight of that unsolved case with her. The narrator still hikes in those woods today, but they never go without a knife, and they always look over their shoulder, half expecting to see a short, broad man skipping out of the shadows. Now, let us move on to the next account. This is a story that was written down by a young man named Artie, while the events were still fresh and terrifying in his mind. Artie and his girlfriend, Katie, had been together for several years, and they shared a deep, mutual passion for the great outdoors. They were experienced backpackers who had traveled all over the United States, tackling challenging mountain trails and dense forests. They were not amateurs. They knew how to handle themselves in the wilderness, having completed several long-distance treks in Colorado and Maine. They had planned a multi-day hiking trip in the beautiful rugged mountains of upstate New York. For people who do not live in New York, the state is often synonymous with New York City, the crowded streets, the tall skyscrapers, and the constant noise. But New York State is actually incredibly vast, filled with rolling hills, massive lakes, and dense, ancient forests. Artie always argued that the nature in upstate New York was some of the most beautiful and underrated in the entire country. Their plan was simple: a 4-day, 3-night backpacking trip deep into the wilderness. It was meant to be a perfect escape from their daily routines, a chance to disconnect from technology, get completely off the grid, and just enjoy each other's company in the peaceful quiet of nature. They packed their backpacks with freeze-dried meals, a lightweight tent, sleeping bags, a water filtration system, and emergency supplies. The first day of the hike went incredibly well. Aside from a few light patches of rain that dampened the trails, they made great progress. The air was cool, the scenery was breathtaking, and they felt completely at peace. By the time the sun began to set, they found a nice flat clearing to set up their campsite. They pitched their tent, cooked a simple warm meal over their portable camp stove, and crawled into their sleeping bags early, wanting to get a head start on the trail the next morning. But in the middle of the night, Artie was suddenly jolted awake. He opened his eyes and noticed that the tent was dark, but he could make out the silhouette of Katie. She was not sleeping. She was sitting straight up, completely rigid. Artie could hear her breathing, which was fast and shallow. She looked absolutely terrified, a state of mind that was completely out of character for her. She was usually the calm, logical one in stressful situations. Artie sat up slowly and whispered, asking her if she was okay. At first, Katie could barely speak. She seemed to trip over her words, her voice trembling in the dark. Finally, she managed to whisper that she had heard something outside the tent. She said it was a sound that had instantly filled her with dread. Artie tried to reassure her. He whispered that it was probably just an animal. In these mountains, white-tailed deer and black bears were common, and they often wandered near campsites looking for food. But Katie shook her head vigorously. She insisted that this was not an animal. Artie told her that he would unzip the tent and take a quick look around with his flashlight to ease her mind. But as his hand reached out toward the metal zipper of the tent door, Katie let out a sharp gasp. She lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with an incredibly tight grip, begging him not to open the tent. Artie paused, his hand still resting on the zipper, looking at Katie's wide, terrified eyes in the dim light. He began to wonder if maybe she had just had a severe nightmare and was experiencing a lingering sense of sleep paralysis or panic. He was trying to decide whether to comfort her or insist on checking outside, when suddenly he felt his own body freeze. He heard it too. Outside the thin nylon walls of their tent, the distinct sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves echoed through the silence of the night. They both sat in absolute, breathless silence, listening. The footsteps were heavy, slow, and deliberate. The way the weight shifted, the cadence of the steps, made it instantly clear that this was not a four-legged animal. It was a person. They were walking in a slow, continuous circle around the perimeter of the tent. But then, the situation went from unsettling to downright bizarre. Every couple of minutes, the person outside would pause, and in the silence, they would let out a quiet, high-pitched giggle. It was a soft, mocking laugh that sounded like a young woman. Artie and Katie had no idea what to do. They did not have any weapons other than small camping knives, and they were miles away from any help. They decided that their best course of action was to remain completely still, stay inside the tent, and pray that whoever was outside would eventually lose interest and leave. The circular walking and occasional giggling continued for what felt like an eternity. But eventually, after a few hours, the footsteps drifted away, and the forest returned to its natural, quiet state. For the rest of the night, neither of them slept a wink. The silence, which they usually found so peaceful, now felt incredibly heavy and tense. When the first rays of dawn finally filtered through the trees, Artie decided it was safe to investigate. He slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside into the cool morning air. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, seeing that the campsite was empty. But that relief lasted only a few seconds. As he looked around the immediate area of their camp, his heart sank. Scattered all over the ground, surrounding their tent, were dozens of strange rocks. Artie knew with absolute certainty that those rocks had not been there when they set up camp the night before. These rocks were different from the surrounding stones, appearing smoother and darker. But they were not just lying around randomly. The rocks had been carefully stacked into neat miniature towers and arranged in strange, deliberate geometric patterns on the dirt. Katie climbed out of the tent, saw the rocks, and immediately started packing her gear. She was done. She wanted to go home right then and there. But Artie, trying to remain the voice of reason, made a foolish decision. He convinced her that it was probably just some local teenagers or other hikers playing a prank on them, trying to scare them. He argued that they had planned this trip for months, and they should not let a stupid joke ruin their vacation. Reluctantly, Katie agreed to continue, but the atmosphere of the trip had completely changed. Throughout the day, as they hiked along the mountain trails, Katie kept constantly looking over her shoulder. She was absolutely convinced that they were being watched, that someone was trailing them from the shadows of the trees. Every time she expressed her fear, Artie would stop, scan the dense forest behind them, but he never saw any sign of movement. By early afternoon, Katie was completely exhausted from the stress and lack of sleep. She refused to go any further. Artie did not blame her. They decided to set up their camp early, and Artie promised her that they would pack up at the very first light of dawn, jog back to the trailhead, and cut the trip short. They would cover the remaining distance in a single day and go home. That night, Artie was sure Katie would be too anxious to sleep. But she was so physically and emotionally drained that as soon as her head touched her makeshift pillow, she fell into a deep, heavy sleep. Artie, however, lay awake. He stared at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the wind rustling the leaves. Hours passed, and he finally began to feel his eyelids growing heavy. He was just about to drift off into sleep when a sudden sound made his eyes snap open. It was a whisper, right outside the tent fabric, mere inches from his ear. He lay perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked over at Katie, thinking she might have muttered something in her sleep, but she was completely still, breathing deeply and rhythmically. Then the whisper came again. It was a soft, clear female voice. It spoke directly into the darkness, saying, "Come outside, Artie." Artie felt his blood run cold. How did this voice know his name? He had never met anyone in these woods, and they were miles away from any town. The realization that someone had been watching them, learning their names, was completely overwhelming and terrifying. Before he could even process the horror of hearing his name spoken by an unknown voice in the middle of the wilderness, a second, slightly different female voice joined in. It whispered, "Yeah, Artie, please come outside. We are waiting." Artie did not move. He did not make a sound. He sat up slowly, his body trembling, trying to decide whether to wake Katie or keep silent. And then the whispering stopped. But it was replaced by something far worse. Suddenly, the sounds of multiple footsteps began to circle the tent. But they were not walking this time. They were running. They were sprinting in fast, tight circles around the tent. And as they ran, they began to laugh uncontrollably. It was a chorus of high-pitched, manic cackling that echoed off the trees, sounding completely unhinged. Suddenly, the laughter paused, and one of the voices dropped into an unnaturally deep roaring register, shouting, "Come outside now." The sudden, loud shout and the chaotic running instantly woke Katie. She sat up, immediately panicking, crying out and asking what was happening. Artie did not even have time to explain because the people outside began to physically assault the tent. They were not tearing it open, but they were leaning heavily against the nylon walls, pushing the sides inward. Then they grabbed the structural poles of the tent, shaking them violently, actually dragging the entire tent and its occupants a few inches across the dirt. Throughout all of this, the manic, high-pitched cackling never stopped. Artie and Katie held onto each other in the center of the shaking tent, completely terrified, feeling utterly helpless. This was far beyond a harmless prank. This felt deeply malevolent, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the physical shaking stopped. Artie could hear the sound of multiple footsteps sprinting away, the laughter fading as the intruders ran deeper into the dark forest. For the next 30 minutes, Artie and Katie sat in absolute silence, staring at each other in the dark, too terrified to speak or even move. When a half hour passed with no other sounds, Artie decided he had to look. He needed to know if they were truly alone. with Katie squeezing his arm so tightly she was cutting off his circulation. Artie slowly, millimeter by millimeter, unzipped a small portion of the tent door. He peeked through the narrow opening into the dark woods. Standing about 20 feet away from the tent, illuminated by the faint moonlight, was a figure. It was a young woman, appearing to be in her mid-20s. She was standing completely still, staring directly at the tent. She had a wide, vacant, deeply unsettling smile plastered across her face, as if she had been waiting for him to look out. Despite the cold mountain night and the rugged terrain, she was wearing a simple, clean white dress. As she made eye contact with Artie through the small gap, she slowly raised her hand and waved at him. Artie instantly zipped the tent shut. He sat back in the dark, completely speechless, his mind racing. Katie, who had been looking over his shoulder, had seen the woman too. She was trembling, silent tears streaming down her face. They spent the rest of the night sitting in the center of the tent, holding each other, waiting for the attack that they felt was inevitable. However, nothing else happened. When the sun finally rose, Artie cautiously unzipped the tent again. The woman was gone, but the campsite had been altered once more. Stacked rocks were scattered everywhere in elaborate formations, and hung from the low branches of the surrounding trees were crude, handmade symbols constructed of twigs tied together with dark string. Neither Artie nor Katie recognized the symbols, but they looked deeply occult and sinister. They did not bother to investigate. They packed their gear in a frantic rush, leaving the rocks and twig symbols untouched, and they ran. They did not just jog, they practically sprinted the entire distance back to their vehicle. They reached their car, threw their bags into the trunk, and drove home in a heavy, shell-shocked silence. Artie wrote down the account as soon as they got back to their apartment. He wanted to document everything while it was fresh. He and Katie still love the outdoors, but they have never returned to those mountains, and they probably never will. The lingering question of how that voice knew his name is something that still keeps Artie awake at night. This brings us to our third and final account, which took place several years ago. The narrator of this story had a tight-knit group of friends from high school, specifically two guys named Theo and Carlos. Every single year since they graduated, the three of them made it a strict point to spend a weekend together in the wilderness. It was a tradition they held sacred, maintaining it even as they grew older, got jobs, and eventually married. No matter where life takes us, we always get together at least once and spend quality time together, reflecting on our lives and keeping our friendship alive. When they were teenagers, they were absolutely obsessed with exploring the outdoors, particularly seeking out caves. They grew up in a town surrounded by heavy woods, and when they were 16, they had stumbled upon a small hidden cave. That discovery sparked a lifelong fascination. Over the years, as they grew into adulthood, they would travel further into the wilderness, specifically looking for geological formations and hidden caverns. They were always careful, prioritizing safety, and in all their years of exploring, they had never run into any serious issues with wildlife or dangerous terrain. On one particular trip, they were hiking through a dense, remote section of the forest when they stumbled across a cabin that was legitimately in the middle of the woods. As they approached the cabin, the three friends began to joke around. They laughed about how they were acting exactly like the foolish characters in a classic horror movie who decide to investigate a creepy, run-down shack in the woods. They walked up to the structure and peeked through the dirty, cracked windows. The inside was almost completely empty. There were a few broken pieces of old wooden furniture scattered across the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust. The place was clearly abandoned, and it had been for a very long time. Carlos immediately suggested that they go inside and check it out. While some people would have turned and walked away, the three friends did not think much of it. Over their years of exploring, they had found all sorts of strange things left behind in the woods. Once, they had discovered a giant clearing in the woods that had a creepy makeshift village. It had all these small huts, and it was filled with giant mounds of debris and trash everywhere. It was scary at first, but they found out after that it was once living quarters for residents of a traveling circus that was in the area for a while way back in the day. So finding an old, abandoned cabin was not something that would send them running. It was just more unexpected than anything else. As they stepped through the rotting wooden door, the narrator began to analyze the structure. It was highly unusual for a cabin to be built so deep in the wilderness with no access roads. In reality, calling it a cabin was a bit of a stretch. It was more like a large, sturdy wooden shed. It consisted of just one single square room. There was no evidence of plumbing, no electrical wiring, and no clear signs of how anyone could have lived there comfortably. The air inside was incredibly dry and dusty, making it somewhat difficult to breathe. Carlos began to sift through the broken pieces of furniture, hoping to find some interesting relic of the past. But everything was completely ruined. As they stood in the center of the quiet room, talking amongst themselves, they suddenly heard a sound. It was a strange, muffled noise that they could not immediately identify. It was soft but continuous, sounding like something heavy being slowly dragged across dirt. Given how small and empty the room was, the source of the sound was highly confusing. The narrator realized the sound was not coming from the room itself. It was coming from directly beneath their feet. The cabin did not appear to have a basement or a cellar, as the wooden floorboards seemed to rest directly on the ground. The narrator knelt down, placing his ear against the dusty floorboards to listen closely. The sound was unmistakable. Something was moving directly underneath the floor. The narrator stood up and began kicking away the broken pieces of furniture and piles of debris, searching the floorboards. In the far left corner of the room, hidden beneath a thick layer of dirt and rotting wood, he spotted a rusted iron handle set into the floor. It was a trapdoor. The narrator knew he had to open it. He grabbed the handle and pulled. As the heavy wooden door lifted, a wave of cold, foul-smelling air rushed out of the darkness below. The odor was absolutely putrid, immediately reminding the narrator of rotten, decaying meat. It was so intense that it made him gag. The narrator reached into his backpack, pulled out a clean bandana, and tied it tightly around his nose and mouth. It did not completely block the terrible smell, but it made it bearable enough for him to continue. Before climbing down, the narrator shone his flashlight into the dark opening, trying to see what was making the noise. It was too dark, and the beam of his light could not penetrate the shadows. But the dragging sound grew louder and more distinct. It was definitely coming from the darkness below. The narrator slowly began to descend the wooden ladder. As he climbed down, the temperature dropped dramatically. It was unnaturally cold, far colder than a normal cellar should be. He reached the bottom and stood on a rough stone floor. He clicked on his high-powered flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The space was relatively small, with two massive wooden structural beams rising from the center of the floor to support the cabin above. From the top of the ladder, Carlos and Theo called down, asking if he could see anything. Before the narrator could answer, his flashlight beam caught a movement. Limping slowly from behind one of the heavy wooden beams was a man. He looked completely ordinary. He was a younger man, clean-shaven with dark, messy hair. He was wearing a simple green t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. The sudden appearance of a normal-looking person in this dark, foul-smelling cellar startled the narrator so badly that he let out a strange, choked shout. But the man did not react to the noise at all. He did not look at the narrator, nor did he show any sign of surprise. He simply continued to limp slowly from the left side of the cellar toward the right side. As he walked, he dragged his right foot heavily across the stone floor, creating the exact dragging sound they had heard from above. The man seemed to be in very poor physical condition. His breathing was incredibly heavy and labored, and he moved with great difficulty. The narrator, trying to remain calm, called out to the man, asking if he was okay or if he needed help. From the top of the ladder, Carlos began yelling at the narrator to get back up immediately and leave the man alone. Theo, who had climbed halfway down the ladder to look, saw the limping figure, panicked, and scrambled back up into the cabin. The narrator called out to the man again, but his questions were met with complete silence. As the narrator watched, the man suddenly stopped. He stood completely still in the center of the dark cellar. He slowly turned his head to the side, locking his eyes onto the narrator. Then he slowly rotated the rest of his body to face him directly. He stood there, perfectly motionless. He was no longer breathing heavily, and his face was completely blank. He began to mumble something very softly under his breath, but the words were completely unintelligible. It was definitely not English, though the narrator could not identify the language. Feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, the narrator began to slowly back away toward the ladder, keeping his eyes fixed on the stranger. As soon as the narrator took his first step backward, the man took a single, sudden step forward. Then he stopped again, staring with wide, empty, lifeless eyes. The sheer wrongness of the situation overcome the narrator. He grabbed the rungs of the ladder and climbed upward as fast as he physically could, scrambling out of the trapdoor and back into the cabin. He told Carlos and Theo they needed to leave immediately. Before closing the trapdoor, they looked down one last time. Standing at the very bottom of the ladder, staring directly up at them through the opening, was the man. He had one hand resting on the wooden rung of the ladder, as if he was preparing to climb up after them. His eyes were wide, vacant, and completely devoid of life. The three friends turned and ran out of the cabin, sprinting through the woods without looking back. They did not stop until they reached their vehicle, although they felt a brief sense of guilt for leaving someone who might have been injured or mentally ill. They knew that something about the encounter was deeply wrong. They drove to the nearest town and reported the cabin and the man to the local authorities. The police did go out to investigate the location, but when they searched the cabin and the underground cellar, they found absolutely nothing. There was no one in the cellar, no signs of recent occupancy, and no evidence to suggest that anyone had been living there. They checked local missing persons databases, but no one matched the description of the man in the green shirt. To this day, the three friends have no idea who or what they encountered in that hidden cellar. The police could not even explain why such a structure had been built so far out in the woods in the first place. The narrator and his friends still meet up every year to hike and explore, but they are far more cautious now, and they have made a solemn promise to one another. If they ever stumble across another cabin in the middle of the woods, they will turn around and run in the opposite direction. Sometimes the wilderness holds secrets that are simply not meant to be uncovered. And so, as the years went by, the narrator got more and more comfortable in their new home. But the problem was, the forest was not just a place of beauty. It was also a place where someone could easily get lost and never be found again. Fast forward to a few weeks later, when the weather started to get much colder and the leaves began to fall from the trees. At this point, the narrator realized that they were not the only ones who had experienced something strange in these woods. It turns out that the local legends were more than just stories. They were warnings that should have been taken seriously. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.